Listening more than once is a simple yet overlooked trick for improving your listening ability. By replaying audio, you give your brain more time to process the language, and as a result, you will understand and learn more. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about how listening more than once can be helpful for developing your listening ability in Chinese. We're going to talk about two different ways in which listening more than once can be helpful. So first, it can increase your understanding of something you're listening to, and this is not very strange. We have all experienced that listening once can be quite hard, and listening twice makes it a little bit easier. So we're going to talk about how that can be useful and how to use that to improve your listening ability. Second, listening more than once can be helpful for consolidating and reviewing things that you have previously learned, and that is then not so much about hitting the replay button immediately after you finish listening to something, but more about inserting a delay of several days or weeks between each listen so you can then use it as an effective review method. But let's start by discussing listening only once, because this is, after all, what we do most of the time in real life, and it's also quite common in different activities in textbooks and courses, and also in some proficiency tests. Listening comprehension in any language is very complex, and the reason we don't think about this every day when we speak our native language is that we have automated the process to such an extent that it has become completely subconscious. We don't notice it and we don't think about it, and that's why it works. That doesn't mean that it will start working if you stop thinking about it in a foreign language, such as Chinese, but it does mean that you need to practice listening to such an extent that many of the processes involved are completely automatic. In order to give you some idea of what we need to do to understand something said to us in Chinese, and this is something we covered in detail in the series called Beyond Topdown, so this is just a summary, we need to deal with both top-down and bottom-up processing. So bottom-up processing, that's when we try to extract information from what we hear. And to be able to do that, we need to be able to identify sounds and tones in the language. We need to be able to combine these to form syllables and combine syllables into words. And we also need to know these words, and we need to be able to connect what we hear and be able to retrieve the meaning of these words, and then form sentences and then try to get at what this person is trying to say to us. That's not all though, because at the same time and in parallel, we also need to do top-down processing, which is the opposite. We start with what we know and we use that to predict or to interpret what we hear. And if we fail to hear something, we can fill it in based on our expectations, prior knowledge, and so on. And these processes aid each other, so if we think we know what someone might say, it becomes much easier to also understand what they are saying. And if we're able to do all these things live at once when someone is talking to us, and remember there might be other things we need to do as well. If we're in a conversation, for example, we need to think about what we are supposed to say, what we're supposed to do, and other social things. Maybe we are a bit anxious and so on. If we're able to do all these things, then we can understand spoken Chinese. I've mentioned this before, but the more I learn about listening comprehension, the more amazed I am by the fact that we are able to understand anything at all, because it seems so complicated and we do so many things at once. And so it's not at all strange that when you listen to something for the first time in Chinese, you will struggle to understand it. If some of these processes that I just mentioned are interrupted or disturbed or not allowed to operate properly, then it's even harder. And just to give an example, if you're listening to bad audio quality, it can be difficult to hear sounds and thereby making it harder to identify the correct words. It could also be that the listening situation you are in doesn't give you much context. Maybe it's on a test and you just hear a recorded conversation. You know nothing about the participants, where they are, why you are listening to this, and what it's supposed to be about. And this is very unrealistic. This does not happen in real life. And when you listen in this way, you can't really have expectations about what people might say because you don't see them, you don't see the situation, and you don't know anything. And so there is no way for you to activate all the knowledge that you might use in order to interpret what people are saying. If you want to learn much more about this as a student of Chinese, or maybe you're a teacher, you can check out the series Beyond Timpudong, where I discuss this in much more detail. And as usual, I'll put links in the show notes. I think all of us have experienced that listening to something a second time enables us to understand much more in Chinese than when we listen the first time. And this can be largely explained by the top-down processing I mentioned earlier. Because when we listen the first time, it can be hard to engage and activate knowledge that would be relevant for us to interpret a certain situation and understand what someone is saying. But when we listen the second time, we know certain things about what we're going to listen to, and that enables us to engage that top-down processing, making it much easier to understand. For example, if you're listening to a recorded conversation, the second time you listen, you know much more about this conversation. You know who's in it, you know roughly how much each person talks, you know what they sound like, you might have figured some things out about the environment they're in, what they're talking about, maybe you know the topic, maybe you know a few things they're saying. And then when you listen the second time, you can use all these clues that you have to figure out even more about what they're saying. This means that you can improve your comprehension of a passage in Chinese by hitting the replay button immediately after listening the first time, without looking up any words or grammar you might not have known or checking a transcript or anything. Just listening one more time will improve your comprehension in itself. Exactly how much you are able to increase your comprehension depends on the difficulty of the passage and your own proficiency, of course, but I've experienced many situations where I'm able to just understand a few words the first time, but then after listening to it twice or maybe 3 times or even more, I'm able to get the gist, and this is without further assistance or without looking anything up, as I said. There is another important reason why this works, and this ties back to what I said about our ability to focus on only one thing at a time, which we might call controlled processing. So that's when we focus on something deliberately and thereby hope to understand more by doing so. And this is then different from automated processing, which we don't think about and which happens all the time, and we don't need to focus, we're not even conscious of it. And so when we're listening to our native language, most processing is completely automated, and we are free to think about other things such as why are they saying this to us, what should I respond to this, what do I want to eat for dinner, or when is this conversation over, or whatever it happens to be you want to think about. When we're listening to a second language, though, this automated processing is not automated enough, which means that we need to compensate with this controlled processing, which is what we focus on ourselves. In part 4 in the Beyond Timbudong series, I used the analogy of a floodlight versus a spotlight. So the floodlight would be something that illuminates everything, but not very specifically and not very clearly. And a spotlight is something that illuminates one thing at a time. So the spotlight is our controlled processing. That's what we focus on when we listen and something we can control. And the floodlight is then the automated processing that is on all the time, and it's not something we consciously control at all. Ideally then, we would like our floodlight to be strong enough that it illuminates the scenery very clearly so we can understand everything without relying on the spotlight. But when listening to a second language such as Chinese, this is very rarely the case. The floodlight is actually quite weak and it is not enough to give us this understanding, so we need to illuminate things with the spotlight. And this is problematic if we're trying to understand what happens in a rapid jungle chase, because if you have your small spotlight and you point it around you, it will not really illuminate enough to understand what's going on. You need the floodlight. Or you need to listen more than once, because if you have already passed through this scene once and your spotlight fell on certain things and you understood some of those things, the second time you know these things already and you can use your spotlight to illuminate things you didn't get the first time, to throw light on things you weren't able to process the first time. And so by listening over and over, you can use your limited controlled processing to actually understand almost everything in a passage. And you might then be limited by other things. For example, if you don't know the words or there are things you really don't know in this conversation or passage, then bottom-up processing can't really help you and you will be in trouble. However, you can still use top-down processing if you have the capacity to do so, because you might be able to deduce what a word means based on what is around it, what has been said previously in the conversation, what simply makes sense to say in this case, and so on. But you need to have freed up the capacity to do this, and this is rarely something you can do while doing all the other things the first time you listen. So to summarize, listening more than once will improve your comprehension in most cases, and this is a good thing because the more you understand, the more you will learn from it. And if there were some things you didn't know, maybe a sentence pattern, maybe a word or so, you stand a much better chance of learning these new things if you understand everything around it, and you're simply unlikely to do that the first time you listen. Naturally, you could also listen to things that are so easy that you understand almost everything the first time as well, but as we all know, finding Chinese listening material below our level that is also very compelling and interesting is not easy. In practice, this means that listening more than once broadens the range of listening material that you have access to. Because if you're just allowed to listen once, most of the material slightly above your level or even on your level will be too hard. You don't understand enough to find it enjoyable and certainly not enough to learn from it. But if you listen more than once, difficulty drops and you can suddenly access more interesting content. You will find that usually the biggest jump in comprehension is between the first and second listen, and then if you listen a third or fourth time, you will still understand more, but the added benefit will drop off as the number of times you listen increases. This certainly doesn't mean that you shouldn't listen more than twice. I think it makes perfect sense to listen more than that, especially if the passage is longer or more complex. But then again, you also have to weigh this against other things, such as boredom. Do you think it's interesting enough to listen to 10 times? And if the answer is yes, then fine, do that. That's great. You might listen more than that if you want. But if you feel that you're losing interest after a while, then maybe you should look for easier content in the first place. Because like I said, the other way of increasing your comprehension is to simply lower the difficulty and find something easier to listen to. There is an interesting phenomenon I want to mention here, and I haven't seen any research about this, but if you know about it, do let me know. And that is that children seem to really like listening to the same thing over and over. I don't think all children do that, but many do, and I know I did as a kid. I watched the same movies over and over, I listened to the same audio tapes over and over. And I did this to such an extent that I can still recite many of these verbatim more than 30 years later. And I'm not sure what impact this has on language learning, but I'm sure it has some. As an adult second language learner, you probably don't have the persistence to listen to something to that extent, so you can actually recite it afterwards. But I do think that listening to the same things over and over can be very helpful because it gives you a reference against which you can check your future usage. For example, if you have a word and you know that in this text or in this song it's used in this specific way, well then at least you have one example memorized. And this is not something I'm going to discuss in detail here, but I am planning an article about memorizing things in Chinese and why that can be useful. I know in this day and age, memorizing and reciting things is not really the way we're meant to learn languages, but I do think that this can sometimes be quite helpful. Before you start listening to the same things over and over all the time, I'd like to also point out that there is an opportunity cost here. If you're listening to the same podcast episode 5 times, you could have listened to 5 different podcast episodes, and of course, if you were aiming for the same level of comprehension, you would have had to pick easier podcast episodes, but that could have been done. And that would have exposed you to 5 different ways of using the words, and different people talking maybe about different topics. And so this diversity gets somewhat lost when you focus on the same thing. So I'm not advocating that you should focus on a very small set of, say, podcast episodes and just grind those until you really know them by heart. I'm just saying that listening more than once, and sometimes many times more than once, can be very helpful, and it's something that you should do when you feel the need to and when you feel interested enough in the content. That means that we have basically covered the first advantage with listening more than once, and that was to increase your comprehension and thereby also increase how much you learn. And the second benefit I mentioned was to review and consolidate things that you have learned. The most natural and perhaps the best way to review words and grammar is to read and listen so much that they pop up in the input and you see them over and over again in different contexts, and gradually you will learn them. This is sometimes hard to do for practical reasons, or because you can't find enough material to listen to and read, or you don't have the time, or something else. And that's when we can use other tools, such as spaced repetition software, we can use flashcards, and so on. But these should be supplements to your diet of listening and reading. They shouldn't be the main course, as it were. One problem with extensive reading and listening as a review method is that once you reach a slightly more advanced level, maybe intermediate or so, you will start encountering words that are not so common that you can count on them appearing soon again, and that makes them difficult to learn. You could solve this simply by reading and listening a lot, and this definitely does work, but one way to guarantee that you will hear the words again is, of course, if you listen to the same passage again, because naturally it will contain the same words. And this is then not something you should do immediately, because the spacing effect is true here as well, and the spacing effect is the phenomenon in psychology and in memory that when we spread reviews out over time, that's more efficient than if we lump them together. So essentially, if you were to try to learn a word and you look at it 50 times in a row, that is not going to do that much for your ability to remember it long term, but if you spread all these 50 reviews out over time, it will be very effective and you will learn the word for sure. So that's a general tip when studying or trying to learn everything. You should not review something you just learned, and you should not review something again immediately after reviewing it the first time. So what I've talked about earlier in this episode is to listen to something again and again immediately, but the goal there is to improve comprehension. It's not a review method. But now we are talking about review methods, and if that's what you're after, you should definitely put some spacing in between your listens. I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I think it's essential to have a personal Chinese audio library where you store everything that you've listened to, or at least everything you liked, and can consider listening to again. Because then you can listen to that interesting podcast episode 2 weeks from now, and you can both enjoy the episode and you can review all the language that appeared in it. So do make sure to save your listening content somewhere where you can access it again. Before we wrap up this episode, I'd like to highlight that it's important to choose the right listening material in the first place. Yes, you can re-listen and re-listen again and again to understand something which is fairly complex in Chinese, assuming that you have the basic words and so on. Simply listening more will help. But do remember the opportunity costs. If you listen to the same thing 5 times, you could have listened to 5 different things instead, and that might have taught you more. And so do try to choose something you can make sense of even without listening more than once. This is essentially something you do when listening once is not enough, or when you really want to listen to something quite difficult. After all, sometimes being interested in what you're listening to is more important than it being on the right level, because let's admit it, sometimes there simply isn't anything super interesting to listen to on your current level, and then you might have to make a little bit more of an effort to understand something slightly harder. What I do want you to remember, however, is that it's rarely a good idea to make it more difficult by choice. So this is something you should do when you can't find anything better. It shouldn't be the default option. The default option, if it is at all possible, should be to listen to things you can make sense of and understand and enjoy after listening only once. If that is not possible or applicable, however, listening more than once can be very helpful. It gives your brain more time to process the language, you will understand more, and as a result, you will also learn more Chinese. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.